Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for our second AMA session with the great and powerful Robert Breedlove. Robert, how are you doing?
Thank you for that intro. I'm feeling pretty great and just standard on the power dimension.
Oh, I love that, man. Last week we had Mark Moss as our first kind of inaugural of this series. You were an instrumental introduction to Mark, and thank you so much for that. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to go through a series of questions. And actually, at one point, I want to get to asking you questions about how you generate questions because I think you are one of the best interviewers that I've ever met and I've ever seen in the work that you do. And it's just incredible the way that you find and interact questions. And I thought, the way we would start today is with a quote that you've actually quoted in one of episodes that you've been interviewed on. And the quote is, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." That's a Rothschild quote. And I
Hmm.
wonder if that's a great way to begin to ask the question that your entire show is about, which is, what is money?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to see you again. It's my first time on Blue Jeans, so I hope I do everything correctly. Um, that quote, it is a really good one because I think it properly places everything in your mind in that typically, if you just ask someone on the street, what is money? One of the first few things they'll likely tell you is that, it's government, right? It's government controlled, government issued. It has to do with government. It's something that government creates. And this is something I talk about a lot on the show is that this is a modern misconception that money it's an emergent phenomenon of free trade. So in any economy that has people trading, something becomes the most marketable good, which is money. All of that's independent of government. That has nothing to do with government at all. But with Rothschild's quote, which is interesting because they remain one of the most wealthy families, if not the most wealthy family in the world. They've been an insider to central banking, let's say, for I think 500 some odd years. Um, that that properly places the elements in a mental model, and that if you can control the money, then you don't care about the legal apparatus as much because the money is the ultimate power, as you might say. So another way to maybe frame this is that the rule of law itself, there's this common, the old adage, possession is 9/10 of the law. Well, based on these conversations I've had, in particular with a guest, Stefan Kinsella, who's a really brilliant libertarian attorney, he makes the point that the entire rule of law exists to resolve disputes over property. Now, property in this sense has to be properly understood in that, your own body, you are your own property. It's kind of your most basic form of property. And technically, it's not the body, it's not the thing or the asset that's the property, it's the relationship. So it's the relationship between the conscious willpower, the decision making apparatus, which is your mind, your human reason, the relationship of that with the body itself. That's the most fundamental form of private property. And then we extend that private property into the world by using our body and our wits to go out and make things of value, build a business, plant a garden, whatever it may be. So it is the rule of law exists as an extension of private property. And the rule of law in a state model is going to be funded by the state, right? The state controls the rule of law. So if property is the relationship between owner and asset, money is, as we said earlier, the most marketable good, makes it basically the ultimate asset, then money is the most important property relationship you can have, full stop, right? Whoever has the money makes the rules, as has been said, or I think it was whoever has the gold makes the rules. That may have also been Rothschild or someone related. So the stack, of human civilization is layer one is human action, right? What are people doing? How are people spending their time? Well, layer two to that stack is if people are engaged in exchange with one another, then the most marketable good in that stack is money. So money's like layer two, if you will, that helps us scale human action in a cooperative way that helps us create more wealth by working in concert, basically, rather than working in isolation. And it's real simple. You could just look around yourself right now. How many of the things that you're using did you actually sit down and create? I mean, 99.99%, you bought them, right? You bought them with money from some other producer. So that's the miracle of the modern economy, that we can create all these amazing things when we engage in trade. But to engage in trade, you need strong property, and the most important property relationship is to money itself. So I think the Rothschild quote really frames it up nicely, that if you just gained the monopoly over money, that you can actually control to some degree people's perceptions. All right, people are perceiving the world through prices, for instance. When you're considering about what car to buy or what house to buy, you're thinking in terms of how many dollars does this house or car cost me? Well, if you are a currency monopolist like a central bank, you can manage those perceptions, basically, right? You can print new money, go into the market, buy up a bunch of housing or whatever it is, and make it comparatively more expensive. Another way to say that is you're actually changing people's valuations, right? And this is all of this bears on our goal orientations, right? What goals do we have for ourselves? How do we want to make money? How do we want to succeed? How do we want to enjoy life? This money relationship is very important to all of that. So, yeah, I guess to button it up, you would say that money is the most important form of property you can have. And if you have a really tightly integrated relationship between you and your money, as in if you're holding gold in your backyard or in your central bank, or you're holding your own Bitcoin private keys, then you don't really care so much about the legal framework, because the legal framework doesn't have a lot of bearing on your relationship to that money. So I hope that made some sense.
So it did, and it made me kind of think about where I want to kind of drive the conversation to, which is a paper that you've written in one of your writings, which is Masters and Slaves of Money. So the question I pose is, are we in fact slaves to money? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it would be useful first to define what a slave is. You could say that any human with a 100% effective tax rate is by definition a slave. That means that all of the value they create, or all of the fruits of their own labor that they produce, go to someone else. If your tax rate's 100%, there's a taxing authority capturing all of that value. So all of your labor, all of your efforts to do good in the world or to satisfy the want of a consumer, everything that you earn from that effort, if you have a 100% tax rate, goes to someone else. So that's how I would define a slave, first and foremost, someone with a 100% effective tax rate. Now you could go to the other end of the spectrum and look at a sovereign entity, which we would typically call a sovereign nation state today, although I would say that there are some large multinational conglomerates and a few other human organizations that meet this definition of being basically sovereign, is they effectively have a 0% effective tax rate. Right? Nobody's taxing the United States, for instance. The United States is at the top of the geopolitical hierarchy and the wealth hierarchy, and they hold the most gold, and we have the largest military. So nobody's taxing the U.S. And part of that, too, is, after World War II, the United States holds the Bretton Woods Conference to codify its position on top of the wealth hierarchy. So it reordered the global banking system such that the dollar would be pegged to gold, every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. So this is just another manifestation of the U.S. being, say, a sovereign entity, and that we codified this position for ourselves that we could export inflation, right? We could basically just print new money export these dollars overseas, foreign nations would send us goods and services. So that entire, let's say, systemization of the banking order was really meant to formalize what we had established by being victorious in World War II. We had the most gold, et cetera, et cetera. So I say that to say, on one end of the spectrum, you've got 100% effective tax rate as a slave. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a 0% effective tax rate, which I would call a sovereign or a sovereignist, if you will. And then to your question then is, okay, are modern humans slaves to the modern monetary system? Well, I guess there's not a bright line yes or no answer. I don't think there's many people in the modern world that are taxed at 100%. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist at all. It does exist, I'm sure, in many places in the world, but most places in the world, people are not taxed at 100%. So they don't meet that hard and fast definition of a slave. But you could then say, and as we said earlier, there's the United States, which is 0% tax rate. There's very few of those, obviously. You could probably also throw China in that bucket. No one's really taxing China. So they're a sovereign actor, Russia, et cetera. But in between 0 and 100%, pretty much everyone on Earth, most people are paying taxes of some kind. So you could use that as a proxy for what percentage of a slave you are. You can go check with your CPA and see what your effective tax rate is over the past 5 years, average it out. Maybe if you're in the US and you're, I don't know, upper middle class, you're probably paying 25, 30%, something like that. I think that's a rough proxy for what percentage of the fruits of your labor are not going to you. They go to somewhere else, specifically to your government. And, Robert Kiyosaki makes this great point that, if your effective tax rate is, say 40%, then the first 5 months out of every year, you're working to pay for the government, not for yourself. So it may sound strong to use a word like slave, but when you look at it that way, that you're working to create value, but you're not getting any of that value for the first, whatever it is, 5 months of the year. Again, this is contingent on your effective tax rate. What else do you call that? I mean, you're working, but you're not getting it. And you have no seat at the negotiating table on the tax rate, right? You just get a bill. And if you don't pay the bill, well, you're going to get more scary grams from the IRS in the US, and then eventually maybe a knock on the door, and then they'll pursue legal action. And if it goes far enough, they'll throw your ass in jail, right? And they'll do it for a long time. So that, I think when you really break it down to the nuts and bolts, it's like, okay, maybe this isn't such a benign system, let's say. And it's better than what we've had historically in many ways. We're not, dealing with God King pharaohs in ancient Egypt, where we're all just doing what we're told all the time under pain of death. I mean, life expectancies have improved, freedom has improved. We have democracy, which may or may not be a good thing overall. It's maybe better than what we've had, but not as good as what we can do, as many Bitcoin proponents would say. But to answer the question, I mean, I'd say that everyone living in a fiat currency regime is at least, which is everybody, basically. There's not many non-fiat currencies in the world. They're at least some percentage a slave. And you could get that, again, through a combination of figuring out their effective tax rate and how rapidly the currency is being debased, right? If you're holding dollars over the past 2 years, well, we've increased the supply of dollars 40% in the past 24 months. The effects of that debasement haven't necessarily percolated out into the economy, but they will over time. And so the direct answer would be yes, everyone is a slave to the currency system by at least a percentage, at least partially a slave, unless you're one of the very, very few who happen to own shares in the central bank. And then you would be the master in that master and slave dichotomy. And the piece you brought up, Masters and Slaves of Money, goes into a lot more depth on all of that, and talks about how counterfeiting currency has been used as a weapon across history to steal human time, to wage war, and do a lot of other things. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question. And I guess the last piece there, which kind of ties into the first question, is like the stronger you can get that relationship between you and your money, or you and any form of property, but money specifically, again, the most important form of property, that's the one you would try to optimize for first. You want to hold a money that is based on equity and reality rather than promises. And that's what physical gold in your hand or in your backyard is. That's what holding your Bitcoin private keys is. That's not what fiat currency is. Fiat currency is a promise, right? It's like, this thing has some value. We promise you we won't print too much of it to where it doesn't have value over time. And so it necessitates your belief in someone else's promise, your faith in a counterparty, like it says on the US dollar bill, full faith and credit of the US government, right? In God we trust. They even lean on the theological domain to try and get some of that I guess belief or faith piggybacked onto the currency itself. And you can avoid all that nonsense of trying to like needing to trust someone or some group or whatever. You can just skip the whole thing by saying like, no, I'm just going to hold my private keys. And
And
that's why Bitcoin's so liberating. You just opt out of this master-slave dynamic.
And if I want to push back a little bit on, and now as we transition into Bitcoin, because there seems to be this opposition or argument of saying, Bitcoin has no value, it has no intrinsic value. Like Mark actually just did a podcast with Peter Zion, and his perspective. I mean, he has some great ideas, but he's got this perspective that Bitcoin's worthless, and it's actually worth negative. It's not even a positive. He has this opinion on that. So what do you say to those people that are, Bitcoin's worthless? It has no effect on the economy, it has no backing, and obviously we believe different things. But how would you talk to that person?
Yeah, it's something that's parroted a lot, this whole notion of intrinsic value, but it's a farce. Intrinsic value is a farce. There was a revolution in the 1800s called the marginal theory of value, or marginalism. And essentially before that revolution in economic science, people believed that value was some objective reality that you could detect in the material world. Like you could take a bottle of water somehow and say, examine it in some way to determine how many. They called these units of value utils, like UTIL, kind of like utility. That this bottle of water would have some cardinal amount of utils in it, right? Some amount of value particles, if you will. Maybe this bottle had 40 utils. The car has 1,000 utils, and that determines the exchange ratio between cars and bottles of water. That was the belief, that value is some intrinsic part of objective reality, basically. The realization was, and this has to do with the water diamond paradox, which is people couldn't figure out, well, if that's the case, then why do we pay so much damn money for diamonds and not so much for water, right? Water's pretty cheap, yet water clearly is very essential to life. Diamonds don't matter at all. It's just conspicuous consumption at best. And the realization in the 1800s, the marginalism revolution, was that no, it's not. There's no objective value like embedded in things. That's bullshit. What you have in the world is people expressing their preferences, right? People buying and selling to express their wishes, ultimately, or in the case of selling, to satisfy the wishes of others at a price. And the realization that all value in the scope of that doctrine is subjective, right? All we can say about value is that anything you're doing in one moment, or anything you're buying in one moment, you're doing that thing at the exclusion of all other things you could possibly do. So there's a rather than cardinal value, which is cardinal numbers are, there's 15 utils in this bottle of water, there's 50 in this car, there's 100 in this house. Value, rather than being cardinal and objective, is ordinal and subjective. Ordinal meaning this is the most valuable thing first, then this second, then this third. So everyone has these. You can think of this as like an internalized hierarchy of value for the things you want. And we're actually valuing things at the margin, right? So it's not, are diamonds more valuable than water? It's at what margin, right? How much water do you need, right? Water might be the most important thing for the first several steps based on how expensive it is, and then maybe diamonds is inserted in there. So all this to say, intrinsic value is nonsense. There is not even something as essential to life as water. I cannot say with objective certainty that it is valuable in all situations. For instance, if you're drowning in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and there's nothing floating anywhere near you, you don't value water that much. You don't want any more water. In fact, you could go for some fucking land pretty quick, because that, in the scope of your circumstances, is the way your internalized hierarchy of values are oriented, right? You want something that will satisfy your wants in any moment. And in the moment of drowning in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, your wants are going to be dry land. So there's nothing objective about it. It's not to say that water is inherently or intrinsically valuable or land is not, or vice versa. It's all contingent on the circumstances of the market actor making the decision. And so anyone that uses the term intrinsic value, you're welcome to repurpose this argument and throw it back at them and tell them they're a moron. I would say maybe a nicer way to do this, just discount anything anyone else says about economics if they use the term intrinsic value. Because intrinsic value, we've known this for 200 some odd years, it's bullshit. What I think many people mean to say when they invoke intrinsic value is they're saying something like Bitcoin doesn't have industrial use. It doesn't have, you could also call this, there's a difference between marketability and utility value. Marketability would be other people want the thing, so it has some value in the market, whether I'm going to use it or not. And utility value would be like something you use to actually satisfy your wants, for instance. So every asset has a little bit of both. The more specific an asset is to a certain activity, the less marketability it's going to have, because it's a very specific use asset. So I don't know, you pick something super specific like telescopes. Telescopes don't make great money because not a lot of people have consistent demand for telescopes, right? It's kind of a niche activity. But a telescope has, as a proportion of its value, has a very small percentage of marketable value, but a very large percentage of utility value, which is you can go out and do this very specific activity, look at the stars in high resolution. That are less specific tend to have more marketability value, right? Again, water is something people are much more likely to stockpile than telescopes because water has this utility value that it is essential to life. Something like, we'll see here. The asset historically with the lowest proportion of industrial use value to marketable value is money. That's another way of saying money is the most marketable good. So when we look at gold, for instance, today, depending on the day, it's got roughly a $12 trillion market cap. Roughly $2 trillion of that is related to demand for gold as an industrial metal. Dental implants, computers, et cetera, whatever gold is used for to create capital or consumer goods. The other $10 trillion of gold's market cap, approximately, is a result of its demand as money, for its basically reservation demand. So the demand to hold gold, stockpile gold. That's what the other portion of its market cap is. So that's why, historically, that's why gold was money, is that it has this much higher proportion of marketable value, and that other people demand it as money rather than as an industrial use metal at the highest ratio. So that's why gold was money historically. Um, but it's not a perfect money because again, what if it's two trillion on 12 trillion is what 16% maybe, whatever the math works out to be, industrial use. The other 10 trillion, 85+% of gold's value is for use as money. So it's money, but it's not a pure money. So the argument against Bitcoin, again, it's conflating intrinsic value and industrial use. But then it goes on, it extends that argument to say, well, Bitcoin has no industrial use, which again, people are often saying intrinsic value instead of industrial use. So they're saying it has 0% industrial use. Well, what does that mean? If it has a
Which is
market
actually,
capitalization,
yeah,
yeah,
which and I think it's interesting they say that because I don't think they understand like the Lightning Network, for example, and how you can actually take a Bitcoin UTXO and make it a payment channel to move money, and obviously like so related to what we do at Zion. So I
mm-hmm.
think it's also an information issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're completely correct about that, and that's why the show was called "What Is Money?" Trying to help people, trying to fix that information asymmetry, I suppose. But the punchline there would be, okay, granted, Bitcoin does have no industrial use, if that's what you meant when you said intrinsic value, whoever you're arguing against. But the flip side of that is, well, what does it have? It has a market capitalization. If none of that market capitalization is industrial use, then what is it? Oh, it's all monetary use. It's 100% marketability premium, 0% industrial premium, which means Bitcoin is a pure money, which is another way of saying like every technology we've used across history as money has been limited by its industrial use case, right? There's two competing needs for this thing. I need to use gold as for dental implants and computers over here, but there's also this competing interest on gold to use it as money over there. So all we've ever had historically were approximations of money, whereas Bitcoin is like the invention of a pure money, first time we've ever had in history. So I think that's what people are trying to argue against when they invoke intrinsic value. But hopefully this little diatribe gave you a sense of how many errors there are in the thinking process.
Sure, sure. And by the way, I'm a full, obviously, like I run a Bitcoin company. We're so aligned as friends, and we talk about these things. So let's transition and start diving a bit into Bitcoin. And I want to bring up this concept of root permissions. You talked to Balaji before his new book came out. This was something that really stuck with me. He shared this is that if you can have a system where the root permissions are independent of the US and Chinese establishments, is why the impact of Bitcoin is so important. And this comes back to the question of central banking. So talk a little bit about what the impacts of this idea of decentralized root permissions into a monetary network matters so much for our decentralized future.
Yeah. I guess I would invoke that model again of human action being layer one. Pretty obvious, right? As Mises said, and built an entire economic science on top of, man must act, which means humans must choose means that are proper to satisfying certain ends. And we have to go into the world and do stuff, right? That's how the world works. Well, layer two of that is the economic system. People actually engaging in trade with one another because both parties benefit. This is the inequality of exchange in economic science. That you and I sit down to do a deal. Your intuition might say that when we do the deal, we've decided that whatever you're trading to me is equal in value to whatever I'm trading to you. But that's not actually the case. Because if it were just equal in value, you and I would never make a trade. We wouldn't do it. What's the point? There's nothing to be gained. So trade actually occurs. This is mutually consensual exchange, actually occurs when both parties to a trade believe they're going to leave the trade better off than they are going into it. So, which is to say, when you believe what I'm giving up is more valuable to you than what you're giving up, and I believe the reverse. I believe what I'm getting is more valuable to me than what I'm giving up. That's when we trade. Right? So it doesn't again, value is subjective, so you could just say this is a psychological profit. It doesn't mean that you're actually better off, because who knows what circumstances you're going to face. But both parties are at least leaving a mutually consensual exchange believing they are better off. So it's creating this psychological profit or value, we could say. Now, in terms of root permissions, and this is like a database analogy. It's like, who has access to the root of this database to modify it? And this gets you into like a whole nother definition of money, which Elon Musk really likes as well, which is that money is just a database for goods and services. You could think about this as money being a list of who owns what. Now, it doesn't mean that when you hold a certain amount of money that you own the building or whatever, that if you hold $1 million and the building's worth $500,000, it doesn't mean you own the building because you have $1 million. But what it does mean is you have the economic potential to go out and buy 2 of those buildings. So again, although money is not all property in the world, it is the most important form of property. So as I said earlier, if you hold physical gold in your hands or bury it in your backyard or hold your Bitcoin private keys, you have physical possession of that money, which means there's no counterparty between you and that asset that can change the relationship at all. So that's a way of saying you basically have root level access to that database, right? If I own 21 Bitcoin out of a possible 21 million, and I hold the keys, then I know with absolute certainty there are no more than 999,000 people, 999 people on Earth that could possibly have more Bitcoin than me, because I have 1/1 millionth of the total supply. And if I'm holding it, like physically possessing it, self-custody as they call it in Bitcoin, you've taken root level access to that database, and there's no one that can change it. So I think maybe that's a good framing for it. And now Balaji, I will say, the guy can generate more ideas per minute than any human on earth. So he may have had more to add to that than I just said, but that's how I think to simplify it in a way that people can really get their head around it and appreciate it. It's just that, right? Like, just envision money as being the Excel spreadsheet in the sky that's saying who has access to what goods and services in the world. Well, the ideal money would be a correct, unauditable, incorruptible spreadsheet in the sky. That, also you could move the entries at the speed of light because it's just information. This was a big problem with gold, by the way. And gold was a pretty good immutable database for who owns what, but it's really hard to move entries on that database. So I'm going to send gold to Japan. Fuck, that's a really expensive endeavor, right? I got to put it on a boat. I got to have armed security guards. I got to trust customs. I've got to ship it across the ocean. I got to do the whole thing in reverse when I get to the other country. Like, there's a lot of friction there to updating the database. Well, Bitcoin has taken those economic principles of gold and basically abstracted them into the internet. So now we have the benefits of an immutable gold database, if you will, but on digital rails that we can move really fast around the world. And Satoshi constructed it such that individual users or holders of this money get root access to the database. That you can see the whole thing, by the way. It's open source technology, so you can see it top to bottom. There's nothing hidden, but you can also just take full control over your equity, let's say, in that pure money that is Bitcoin.
And actually own something for the first time. I think when you think about property and you think about ownership of property, like, when you own a home in the United States, for example, and you got to pay property taxes every year. And if you don't pay property taxes for about, I don't know, 10 years, government owns your house now, and it's
Right.
an equal value. Like in some states, like Texas is like there's no state income tax, but there's very heavy property tax. So you think about ownership, and in Bitcoin, it's something that you actually can own and hold, and someone can basically never take that away from you. I mean, it could be seized potentially if someone, does something nasty, but it can't ever be stolen. I think that's the
Mm,
discrepancy. You know, one thing that people talk about is Bitcoin as a blockchain, but Bitcoin is really a time chain. Um,
mm.
let's talk a little bit about understanding the differentiator between the concept of a blockchain as a technology, but really the impetus of a time chain and
Mm.
why it's so important that Bitcoin is a time chain.
Yeah, I'll speak to the property stuff first real quick. Um, Real estate's a great example for this. Again, and you really have to rewire your brain because when you say property, first of all, people typically think real estate right out of the gate. Like, oh, when I use the word property, someone's thinking land, typically hopefully with a house on it, maybe an office building, whatever. That is property, but that's not the case. It's the relationship, right? It's how do I know that I have exclusive and exhaustive rights to that property, to that piece of land or car or anything. And with real estate, pick your number. If your real estate taxes are 3%, well, what is the old law of 72? Every 25 years, you're basically paying for the full value of that house, right? Maybe it's every 30 years. So, do you own the house? I mean, sort of, like as long as you pay your taxes, which again, as we talked about taxation at the top of the show, not consensual exchange, you just get a bill. And if you don't pay the bill, then you don't own the thing anymore, right? After a long enough period. So, sure, you could say that you own it, but you own it at the leisure of the state. And they will take it anytime they want. Now, this is not a big problem typically in the Western world, although it does happen. You can look up things like eminent domain, right? If they want to build a highway or a pipeline or something, and your property is in the way, they will buy it at
Bye
whatever
bye.
price they choose. Yeah.
Yeah.
And people have been hurt by that. I know people in Tennessee that have been hurt by that. But in outside the Western world, historically, this has been much more overt. States will just literally doctor the ledger. Like your family owned a piece of land for generations, and it's like all of a sudden the wrong bureaucrat gets in office, scribbles out your name, and puts his friends, and that's that, right? You don't own the thing anymore. So, and that's because all of that function of preserving the relationship between owners and assets, we've just let the state take that. The state controls the list, basically, of who owns what now. And states historically have both the incentive and the precedence of updating that list to their own benefit at the expense of others. Um, so, all that to say is this is an important thing to know. Property is yours to the extent that you can defend it. It's not like you got a sheet of paper that says you own the car and that's yours forever. It's like, well, maybe not. If someone comes to steal the car, or you don't pay a bill or something, it might get um, I don't even know what's the word where they seize your car if you haven't paid the loan on it or whatever. So
Repo.
repo, that's right. So it's not pure ownership. That's when we distinguish something like holding physical gold or holding Bitcoin. Like you just have a bearer asset is the term we use for this typically. It's just that the possession of the thing implies ownership of the thing. I don't need, hold my own Bitcoin private keys. I don't need a title to my Bitcoin private keys that some bureaucrat signed off on and says they're mine. It's like I own them. I control them. I can move them anytime I want. There's nothing you can say to do about it. No one can stop it, reverse it, interrupt it, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, Bitcoin in many ways is kind of like an original form of ownership, and that you can just hold this piece of information that is your private key in any number of ways. And by this simple act of possessing or exhibiting control over those private keys, you own the asset. It's like ownership and knowledge of said ownership are the same thing. It's like they've become Satoshi is unified, knowing and owning, as some people say in Bitcoin. And that's really
And
interesting
is
because we've never had an informational property right before.
and is it, one thing I heard is the ownership of the private key the asset or the permission to transfer the asset at a future point in time? I've heard that there's these two ways to think about what your private key is. It's not like
Mm.
you're holding this key and you own the Bitcoin. It's just, and maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I heard that in an analogy once and I was like, wow, it's the permission to relinquish control.
Yeah, you could say that your Bitcoin private key is just a secret, right? There's this needle in a haystack of the haystack is of, cosmic, universal, if not multiversal proportions. And then your private key is just one needle in that giant, giant haystack. If you have knowledge of the key, then you basically have permission to update the database, that is the Bitcoin network, to the tune of however many UTXOs you have, which is how much Bitcoin you have, basically. I hope I'm saying that technically correct, but that is a better way to think about it, and that the private key is not the thing itself. This is where Bitcoin's really weird. It's hard to understand, but it's to know the secret that gives you the permission on the Bitcoin network to update the ledger, basically. You just leave it at that. So what's really interesting there is that our whole domain of property, other than bearer assets, like I said, physical gold, like if you're holding physical gold, you don't need a title to that, right? It's a bearer asset like Bitcoin. But what's different is that, well, gold can be physically seized because it's physical. Much easier to physically seize. Not to say Bitcoin's not possible, but there are ways to custody your Bitcoin, specifically multi-sig, that I talk about a lot, that I think makes it pretty damn near unseizable, right? If you construct an intelligent multi-sig schema and you've got geographically distributed signers, pretty fucking hard to steal your Bitcoin if you do it like that. So we could say that Bitcoin is the emergence of a non-state property right, a pure property right, and that I now have a globally transactable money and property interest that no one can disrupt, no one can mess with, no one can do anything about, right? You can put your private keys on your brain and cross a border, you can do all the things. Gold gave you these advantages to some extent, but not, because you can't put gold on your brain, right? Gold's very heavy, very physical, hard to move. So we could say that Bitcoin has either enhanced this non-state form of property right we call bearer assets by making it digital, which gives it all these advantages of portability and concealability, things like that. Or you could say that Bitcoin kind of is it is property, right? Like just like it was a pure money, it's a pure property. All these other properties we had historically came with the liability of state interference, basically. And that interference typically manifests as taxation and say, hey, you own that house? Great. Give me 3% every year, or we take the house. So there's a liability attached to that asset, which means it's not a pure asset. So Bitcoin is unique in that respect. And then you mentioned blockchain versus time chain.
Yeah.
Satoshi never used the term blockchain. He only used the term time chain. And I don't know where blockchain came from actually, but it's in reference to the chain of blocked transactions that the network generates every 10 minutes roughly. But what's the name of that piece? There's a great piece. I can't think of the title of it at the moment, but basically makes the point that essentially what Bitcoin is a clock. Man, it is just a clock. It's just, instead of fixing block time to every 10 minutes, it lets that waver, right, for the difficulty adjustment and whatnot. So it targets an average of every 10 minutes for new blocks. But the block height that it actually produces is one of the most immutable, if not the most immutable, timekeeping pieces there's ever been. And so that opens up this whole other vista on Bitcoin, and that I talk about this in Masters and Slaves of Money. The opening line is, money is a tool for trading human time. So what we're trying to do in this whole game of economics is that's what economize means, right? Make better use of our time, accomplish greater results with less efforts, a number of ways to say it. And that money is the scoreboard of that game, right? It's like how many favors have I rendered to the market that saved people enough time in certain ways that I've now reaped that as profit and money that I can now take that money into the marketplace and redeem it for the time of others. So Jeff Bezos, for instance, how much time has he saved human beings through the creation of something like Amazon, right? Like how many trips to the store, how many
Millions of hours a day.
millions of hours a day, probably. Seriously. If you contrast,
Millions. I think it's millions of hours a day.
I think you're
Fully.
probably right. And if you,
Like the automation of your life.
yes, yes. So that is just a specific example of what I was just trying to say. Is like, okay, there's your guy, entrepreneur Jeff Bezos, constructed a business that saved people millions of hours per day. And that was reflected in the equity value he created at Amazon that he now owns a substantial portion of. So now he is one of the richest men in the world, and he can take that money into the marketplace, and people move for him, right? Their time, they will spend their time servicing whatever wishes Jeff wants fulfilled based on this original transaction of him saving people millions of hours per day by building Amazon. So yeah, in that way, money is time, right? They're kind of the same thing. Well, Bitcoin perfectly reflects time. We've never had, the way I typically say this is before Bitcoin, the only two things in the universe that were absolutely scarce were time and energy. But now Satoshi invented Bitcoin, which is 21 million, right? That's an absolutely scarce fixed supply. And it maps perfectly onto the time and energy that money is meant to be an emblem before. So yeah, time chain, not blockchain.
And I find that just such a fascinating topic because, even pretty much everyone is just always trading their attention for money, right? That's what a
Mm-hmm.
job is effectively, is,
Mm-hmm.
is that your life force energy, your time is being traded for money. And I think the interesting thing about this time chain is that we're getting to a point where there's more than the monetary asset that can be anchored to the
Mm-hmm.
Bitcoin blockchain, right? So one of the, we've talked about this before, like the evolution of Zion V2 coming out soon is going to have these DIDs, these decentralized identifiers for individuals, for creators like yourself, that end
Mm-hmm.
up getting anchored in a hash as a transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain. So your identity, the person that you are from that moment forward, will be held at a certain block height at a certain time, and says, my identity is now anchored to the most immutable digital ledger that's ever been created. And I think there's something really fucking cool about that. Like, to me, that's a
Mm-hmm.
really cool thing.
No, it is so damn cool. And there's a lot. Yeah, the idea of a tamper-proof database or an incorruptible database is another way to put it. Another way to put it clearly has huge implications for money as a database, as we've described. But there's a lot of other databases that are important. Identity is one, right? This is another one the state owns and controls. That's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself, because if you get these non-state DIDs, and Balaji goes into this too, is like, why would you even have one ID? Like, we're very accustomed to thinking, oh, I'm Robert, I have one identity inside of this state, and
No,
it's
you can have a multitude of DIDs. That's the
right,
beautiful thing.
right.
And again,
So,
they're all held by this private key.
mhm. So you could, I mean, this is where things get really wacky, because all of a sudden you're like, all right, instead of just having my name and social security number, birth certificate, whatever, that is my ID, my one centralized ID in this one nation. Well, now you could have all these different avatars or identifications for different purposes, right? You could have one ID that maybe is pseudonymous, is not even connected to your, quote unquote real world ID, and maybe you use that to earn money in different countries or do deals of a certain kind. You could have another ID that is connected to your public persona for, video gaming or something that you want to be known for, or sport, whatever it may be. It creates a brand. It's just, the implications are so staggering, I can barely talk about it. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, all of a sudden you could just create many different
Yeah.
versions of yourself and live in all these different domains, and who knows where that goes.
And of course, and I think the interesting thing is we're just getting to the beginning of it because it's not just that the state owns these identities, right? It's actually that non-state actors like Google have owned your
Yep.
identity for so long. Like there's 1.5 billion people around the world that use a Gmail account as their base identity to log into everything that they do in their digital
Right.
life. Sometimes their bank, obviously their Facebook, their Twitter, their Instagram, all these other things they believe they have ownership. But
Mm,
essentially, the crux is that at one point, Google can decide that this relationship is no longer in their best interest and everything downstream disappears. And I think as we
right.
see the increase of censorship, as we see the increase of inflation. So I want to, one of the questions I really wanted to ask you, and we're kind of going down this parallel, is that how do you develop your approach to interviewing? And I mean, you're one of the best interviewers I've ever met, and asking questions and finding the right questions to ask some of the most influential people in the world.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I'll take the compliment, but it's not a view I share necessarily about myself. So, um, I started doing the show in November 2020. We started with Michael Saylor, and we've done almost 200 episodes since. So it's been drinking from the fire hose to a large extent, talking to a lot of different people about a lot of different things. And I'll tell you, Justin, I didn't really have a a well-defined strategy to become a good interviewer, and I wouldn't be comfortable describing myself as a good interviewer. But what I have done that I guess would be helpful is that for anyone looking to interview people, I try to only talk to people I want to talk to about things I want to talk about, right? Things that I'm actually genuinely interested or curious about. I think you can't fake that necessarily, right? I can't feign interest in whatever thing that I'm not interested in. It's just not going to be a good show. I'm not going to ask good questions. I'm not going to be engaged. My assumption is that if I'm not engaged, then my audience is not going to be engaged. Um, and a lot of this is, I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. He's very inspirational in a lot of ways, but he talks about this one specifically that if you're writing something, I think writing was the example he used, and it bores you, then you're writing about the wrong thing. Like, don't write or think or talk about things that bore you. It's just not for you, right? You're not cut out for it, or you're not engaged in it. There's someone else that would be, so let them focus on that. And you as an individual should just try and focus on those things that call to you. So, when I'm formulating questions specifically, you know, I like to read what my guests have written or books they have suggested. All right. Sometimes I'll just go through, my guests will recommend one of their favorite books. I'll read the book. As I'm reading it, I'm generating questions in a note document or by hand. And then before we interview, I typically prepare an outline of, my thoughts and questions. And then I try to just ask the ones that I'm really curious about. And, again, I don't know that this is a formula per se, but what I found that works well is I use that conversation outline to give us some semblance of let's say orderliness to the conversation, a direction, like we're moving through something. We're not just going to get lost in all these rabbit holes. But I also don't want to stick to that outline too tightly. I want to give the conversation room to breathe, rooms for, what I call the chaos of conversation, where, we just have these serendipitous connections, or maybe a question comes up when they're saying something, and you let the conversation flow into these other channels. But then you can always, you get to the end of that channel or whatever, where you're both at the edge of your own understanding and you've figured out what you're going to figure out in that moment. Then you can come back to the structure of the outline and continue forward. So this dynamic dance, if you will, between like the order of the outline and the chaos of the conversation, is where I'm trying to always drive the boat, just keeping it between the buoys, so to speak.
But you do such a good job, and it's always an incredible. I mean, that Jordan Peterson interview at the end of the Bitcoin week in Miami was just to see it up front, to see you right there with him was a very cool live, very cool thing. Like very, it was like just honored to be there in that energy. So we're
Yeah,
wrapping
me
up.
too.
We're wrapping up at right around 55. I want to thank you so much, and there's a couple things I want to dive into, but this might take like I want to talk about recessions and getting into some of those things, but that might require a second conversation
Yeah.
a little bit further down the path. But I want to thank you so much for taking some time. One question that did come in while we were kind of live is a question about Celsius and this concept of like how does something like that get prevented?
Mm.
And someone kind of I don't know the name that came in on that question, but you know how does this event get prevented in the future of what happened with Celsius? And maybe some context. Celsius basically froze user funds because I think we'll find out in bankruptcy proceedings. But
Yeah, I mean, this all goes back to the very simple mantra in Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coin, not your keys, not your cheese, whatever you want to call it. That, as we just described, I mean, in this interview, core to the value proposition of Bitcoin is the fact that you can custody it yourself. You don't need to leave it with a bank or in trust with anyone whatsoever. If you're not self-custodying your Bitcoin, then you're not going to enjoy the self-sovereignty benefits of Bitcoin. You're just not. You're trusting someone else. You're trusting a custodian to hold your assets, and that's not. Again, that's not what Bitcoin is, right? That's not this non-state um, property right where you're holding a. You have to bear the asset physically for it to be a bearer asset, I guess would be the punchline. So with Celsius, now this is not the first time this has happened. We've been having custodial blowups in Bitcoin for as long as Bitcoin's been around, pretty much. Um, Celsius in particular was extra dirty in that they were just offering Bitcoin holders these ridiculously cheap loans. I think they were offering, lending them, so this is where, and these are always over collateralized loans. So people would put up, I'm just going to pick numbers out of the sky. I don't know the exact ones they use because I've never used Celsius. Give Celsius $100,000 in Bitcoin, get a $50,000 loan at 1%, right? So you're putting up 2x the collateral to borrow 1x loan. And maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was 3x. I'm not sure. But then they would loan it to you at 1%, which is like, it's a huge inducement to people to then post their Bitcoin and borrow cheap cash, right? So you don't have to sell your Bitcoin. You can get a little bit liquid, et cetera. But you're obviously taking on the counterparty risk. And so there's that aspect to the business. But then the other aspect, which is even dirtier, is the yield generation, where you just stick your Bitcoin or whatever asset in custody with them, and they are going to take this out into the marketplace and lend it and relend it and do all these basically open market financial operations to generate yield.
rehypothecate.
Yes, rehypothecate. It's a lot of that. It's a lot of making paper Bitcoin, right? So, and that is what creates the systemic risk, because then you get one group, borrowing from another group, relending to another group at 100 basis points higher. That group lends it to another group at 100 basis points higher, and you get these daisy chains of just systemically interconnected leverage. And when, as Buffett says, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. And the really nasty part of this is that those kind of deceptive, but definitely deceptive, I would say borderline predatory business practices of Celsius, where, the guy, what's his name, Macheski, was telling people, hey, Bitcoiners are ruining people's lives because they tell them to hold their own coin, hold their own keys. Then, like, do you know how many people have lost their private keys and have lost all their money? Like, just put your Bitcoin with Celsius and get a yield on it. That's the safe alternative. Like, for someone to say that with a straight face, I mean, that's some really shisty shit. So,
It was a. I'll tell a quick like confession story. Was after we raised quite a bit of capital and we were doing some diligence around, why are we holding so much cash? And we're
Mm,
like, oh, look, maybe we should look into Celsius. And at one point, we were looking into deploying that like a significant seven figures into them, and something in my body was like, dude, just wait, like, so, like, just don't do this right now. And I can't even fathom if we were one of these victims of like, we had just done
mm,
this and thank God we didn't do it, thank God I
mm,
trusted the body of like, because it's
mm.
it's if it's too good to be true, it's very like
Yes.
this magic internet money, like, I'm an investor, you're an investor, you've had like, I've had almost 7 years since I sold my company. And as an investor, I've realized how hard it is to get a 7 to 10% yield on your
Mm,
investments. Like, it's
mm,
not easy. Like, you need to
mm,
work and work and work, and thinking that you're just going to deposit in some account and it's
mm,
just going to magically come to your bank account is just unfathomably not realistic. It
right.
doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. And I don't think people understood the amount of risk that they were taking. Like,
Right.
they were taking a significant amount for not a lot of payout. Like what are you getting? 7%, but the risk on this premium is probably you should be paying 50% because that's how
Y-
risky these loans were that were being done.
Yeah. I mean, when you're risking, you have 100% risk, or you have risk of 100% capital loss. Like, is any yield worth it at that point? Like, if at any time the thing could just blow up, like, I don't care if you're paying me 100%. Not really a game I want to play. I'd rather just
Yeah.
hold the capital. And so it's a great point. There's no such thing as risk-free reward. And we may have been conditioned to think that way, with things like U.S. Treasuries and interest on savings accounts historically and all that. But there's always been risk in that system to generate any yield whatsoever. And I think with Bitcoin, if people could just accept this core, what I think is a truth, you don't need yield on Bitcoin. You don't need it. Just fucking hold it forever. And the more dollars
Yeah.
they print, the more valuable it becomes. So it's like, it's already going up 200% year over year on average the past decade. How much more do you need? Like, do you need that 7 or 8% extra? Just hold it. Just hold it.
And it's the one thing you can. And I think that's the beauty
Hmm.
of it, is that you can truly own it without anyone fucking with you. Like, you can be
Yes.
unfuckable with. And
Yes.
I think there's power in that. And it's an asset that, no matter your wealth gap, no matter like if you're buying $100 of it or you're buying $100 million of it, you can buy the same
Mm.
thing. I think that's
Yes.
really cool as a thing. It's like as a very, very, very cool thing. And I'm so honored to be building on Bitcoin. I think Zion being a Bitcoin company, we're so honored to take this to retail in a big way of having like people now transact in Bitcoin to buy videos and content. And we're really excited for the V2 and honored that you're part of this journey with us, Robert. So I'm going to wrap this up. We're a little bit over an hour. Thank you, everyone that's listening today. Next week, we have a really special guest from Block that is joining us to talk about decentralized identity. And hope to see you guys all next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.